excellent. All right, thank you so much for your patience. I have to say, your graciousness knows no bounds. This is a story about Robin Hood. And it's an origin story about Robin Hood. He could still hear his mother's faint voice. Robin. Robin. He woke with a start. He did most nights. The wind howled through the trees, and it sang worse and more shrill than any of the birds, as it chilled his bones and sinew as he lay along a log. Merry with mead he was not, nor in the happy summertime of his youth. Robin was thrust too soon into manhood and could hear, Robin, Robin. We'll back up. Robin of Locksley. Robin of Locksley was a well-knit, comely strapling. He was a finely put-together young man, with his raggedy long hair and his dishevelled almost beard that he convinced himself was stylish. He was clad in Lincoln green because it was the cheapest material he could find. And he had only two loves in the world. The first was going with his father. And his father was a forester. And foresters, back in the day, they were as well respected as abbots or barons. They were responsible for the running of huge swathes of the greenwood. And his father, the forester, was the forester around Nottinghamshire. And he loved nothing more than as soon as he could walk, tripping out, stumbling through the shade with his father, following along and listening to the stories of Will of the Green. Will of the Green, the notorious bandit who had kept the king and his men so busy and vexed for 30 years, it was said, 30 years ago. Will of the Green, his father didn't really believe he'd ever existed, but for young Robin of Locksley, Will of the Green was a hero. Will of the Green peopled his imagination. Will of the Green ran through the woods, and he could see the band of merry men, rascals and adventurers, rapscallions all, as they charged through the greenwood. And Robin of Locksley, when he played and ran and danced and learned to fire his first bows by his father and learned to string them and make a grey goose shaft, as clear a flight as any could muster, when he learned the skills of archery and woodsmanship, when he learned how to travel the great woods, he wanted nothing more than to be a forester just like his father. Well, his mother was very upset by this. His mother had ambition that he would become renowned at court, or perhaps he would join the clergy. He would have a simple, quiet life where you're much less likely to get shot or stabbed. But seeing how happy he was, and seeing how at home he was, and seeing clearly how at peace he was among the leafy greenery, seeing how his skill with bow could equal any man's, and his arms, while not yet as strong as his father's, were not yet the mighty oaks that they would become, were those of a fine young man. Well, his mother wasn't the only person who'd noticed this fine young man. There was also nearby a local baron and his daughter, the lovely Maiden Marian. And Maid Marian had caught the eye of young Robin of Locksley because they'd been youths who grew up around the same time, and her tower was visible from the tallest tree in the forest of Nottingham. The very tallest tree, you could just look out, cresting the canopies like a green blanket stretching out before you, and you could see through the distant mists a waving, smiling, Marian-like figure. And many was the time and oft that Robin would leave a white flag fluttering on the top of the tallest tree, and Marian would have a look out, see the white flag, and just go for a walk farther and make her way out to meet him among the woodlands, where they engaged in all the activities that young men and women have done forever in this country, though not in others. And things were looking good for Robin. You know, he had a very attractive lady friend who was high-ranking in station, but his father, was he not the forester for the region? Did he not have men and dogs and servants underneath him? Robin was used to a certain amount of luxury. But Robin's father had two enemies. a lean sheriff and a fat bishop. And the lean sheriff and fat bishop found a common companion, the lean sheriff of Nottingham and the fat bishop of Banbury. That's where it was. And they found a common companion. And the common companion was a rather nasty piece of work. And the rather nasty piece of work, his name was Thomas Fitzhugh. And Thomas Fitzhugh was, we can boo. Thomas Fitzhugh. Oh, he was a nasty piece of work. Oh, you don't want Thomas Fitzhugh. No, no, no. Let's go with that. Okay, we'll have a boo every time I hear his name. Thomas Fitzhugh, who was a nasty piece of work. When he walked into the tavern, the piano stopped and everyone turned and looked at him. He kicked puppies and birds died in the trees when he walked through. Thomas Fitzhugh was a forester of mean talent, of meagre capacity, but of huge ambition. And he looked around and he saw who the goodliest, who the kindest, who the most decent forester was, because he knew, because Thomas Fitzhugh was not a nice person. Thomas Fitzhugh, oh, what a wrong 'un. He knew that anyone who was good and kind and decent, who was good at their job, who was honest and loyal and faithful and brave and true, would be easy pickings for someone willing to play from the villain's playbook. And he had his eyes set on a forester pure of heart and with true intentions, which was Robin's dad. And so he pulled the strings that he could pull, which was the string of a lean sheriff and the string of a fat bishop. The sheriff was easier to move. And he pulled the strings. And they connived to arrest Robin's father for treason. Treason, I ask you. Robin's father, who had never been anything but a good and decent man. Robin's father, who had never shown anything but strict and pure loyalty to the king. Robin's father, who was no more guilty of treason than me or you, madam. Or maybe me or you, I'm not sure. It's just been the Jubilee and you're not wearing your flags. But oh, you are wearing your flag. All right, okay. I have been completely one-upped here. We have Jubilee nail painting, which is used to... Certainly will. Let me bow in deference. I'm so sorry. They're claws, all right, yeah. Robin's father, who was second only in terms of deferent loyalty to the crown than the lovely audience member that we have in the front row right here. He was accused for treason. And Robin and his mother were turfed out. The Shire Reeves men turned up one blustery winter's night. There was a rap, rap, rap. And the door opened with a creak in the hinges that Robin's father had been promising his mother that he'd get to, right? And there's a or his mother opened it. And she was expecting her husband back home. She was expecting, trudging through the snow, to take off his smelly boots in the middle of the floor and not by the door like she told him all the time. In was going to come her husband, who was going to shrug off his jacket, miss the hook, it would fall on the floor, and he'd go and sit himself down, ready to pick up a pint of brown October. And so she came to the door, hearing the creak and thinking, that man is never going to fix this door. And the door opened, and rough hands grabbed her, and mailed fists pulled at her hair and threw her to the ground in the snow outside. And Robin saw this and came running outside. Mum! Mum! How? And a mailed fist clocked him around the side of the cheek, struck him a nasty blow. He was seeing stars and he was dizzy and he collapsed in the snow, and Robin was down. And the grey stained the otherwise perfect blanket of white with a little crimson hue. And him and his mother were kicked out of their house in the middle of winter. And they begged to know what had happened to her husband, to his father. And all they would say was that he was a traitor and that he would rot in the jail until charges were brought. And as soon as charges were brought, he would be hanged by the neck until he was dead. Boo! I know, what a wrong 'un. And so Robin took his mum and tried to find a home for her. He said, don't worry, Mum. Don't worry. Well, I know. We'll go visit. I've got a friend, Marion. She'll let us in. She'll give us somewhere to stay. She'll give us safe shelter. And so he took his mum with everything they had, which was the clothes that they'd been thrown into the street with. They didn't have time to pick up their meager possessions. They didn't have time to get all of the arrows and bows that he'd made or any of his father's tools. They were seized immediately. Any money that was on the property, any food, they left with nothing. And they made their way through the woods until they reached the dark and forbidding tower, because it was the middle of the night when they arrived, and Robin, who'd never come to the door to see Maid Marian, who'd only ever summoned her by way of flag, and he hadn't seen her recently, came and knocked on the door and hammered on the door, and the wind battered at them, and his mum gathered to him and pulled her clothes, her night clothes, around herself. And Robin came and hugged her. He said, "It's all right, Mum, it's all right." And he hammered on the door again, and eventually the door was opened by an old and wizened servant. And the old and wizened servant had kindly eyes. And he looked at Robin and he said, "Hello, young man. It's very late in the night for visitors or for tradesmen. I assume you are neither. What is it?" And Robin said, "I am a friend. I am a close and bosom companion to the young Maid Marian who lives here. Fetch her, rouse her, wake her, and she will vouch for me, and she will welcome me in. Please, my mother and I need somewhere to stay." And the servant said, "I am so sorry. I would like to believe what you are saying is true, but I have strict orders not to let anybody in, and the Maid Marian has been sent away to court. She has been summoned to go and be a handmaiden to Queen Eleanor. She's been summoned to go and wait on the king." And Robin said, "That can't possibly be true. She would hate that. She would never like to go to court. Well, on whose orders? On whose authority?" "The Sheriff of Nottingham. He's a very thin sheriff." And Robin realised, boo, I know. What a collection of wrong-uns, eh? And Robin realised that his doors were closing in front of him. His options were diminishing, his avenues spiralling down, and he had very few places he could turn. So he went to his father's brother, or some would say his uncle. He went to go and see his uncle, Tom Gamester. And Tom Gamester, he was a forester, he worked for the foresters. He wasn't as mighty or proud as his father had been, but he had a humble cottage. But the humble cottage was on the other side of the forest of Nottingham, and while Robin could walk through the forest as easily as breathing, Robin had spent days and weeks and years tripping and trailing through the forest, and he could find his way sure-footed as any animal that was born there. His mother didn't last the winter, and he was forced to bury her shallowly, for in winter the ground is hard, in a frozen patch of ground, with a grave that he could mark only with a wooden cross. Oh, I know, it's really sad. And so he made his way, sorrowful, to Tom Gamester's cottage. And when he got there, he knocked on the door, and Tom Gamester opened the door, and Tom Gamester was like his father. He was a larger-than-life man, and he hugged Robin, he took him in, and he said, "Robin, there you are. Robin, thank goodness. Robin, by the grace of Our Lady, I'm so glad you're here. Where's your mother? I'm so sorry about what happened to your father." And he said, I know, they arrested him." "No, didn't you hear? He died, Robin. He died in prison before those accusers of his could decide what charges to bring him up on." And so Robin realised that Tom Gamester was the only person he had in the entire world. And Tom Gamester looked at this young stripling, this young, sprightly orphan, this boy with so much vigour and fire and pain and potential. And he said, "I'll take you in, my boy. Of course I will. Of course I will. Come in, please, make yourself at home." And he did the best he could. Tom Gamester was a bachelor, and he didn't have a very big house, and he didn't keep it very well, but that was okay because Robin liked to spend his time outdoors anyway. He came home to sleep sometimes, and that suited the arrangement perfectly well for the two of them. Robin made his intentions very clear. He wanted to work and go and eventually become a forester like his father and like Tom, and Tom said when he's old enough, he'd love to introduce him, he'd love to take him down, he'd love to have him shoot with some of the yeomen. And he tried to talk him out of it. He said, "Well, maybe a career in the church, or maybe a career in being, I don't know, like an accountant or something, Robin. This is, seriously, this forestry is dangerous, and the men, they aren't always good, decent, loyal people." But Robin's eyes would not be deterred. His father had died in his absence, and the memory he had of his father, the mighty and unvanquishable hero, The boyhood model of masculinity that he had formed would prove impossible to relinquish. And with his dying mother's words still echoing in his head, he had this model of his father, the brave forester, and the wonderful, dappled, summer-lit evenings they had spent together, running through Sherwood Forest and listening to stories of Will of the Green. Well, a few years passed and Robin bulked out and Robin bulked up and Robin grew up, and it was time, said his uncle, that he took a profession, that he found a career, that he showed himself a man. And Robin said, yeah, I am a man. Yes, absolutely. His voice still cracking. He now had finished in the moustache, but it still didn't have the full beard. But his uncle had seen how he shot, and his uncle said, well, they will be hiring new foresters. There is a tournament where they will ask to see your shooting and your wrestling and your skill with cudgel. And if you can prove yourself among the greatest men that we have to offer, and why not, Robin, I've seen you shoot, then you will be offered a place among the Lord's personal retinue. And Robin's eyes turned into giant golden coins, and he went, this was everything he'd ever wanted. He could finally be a forester like his father. And all he had to do was prove himself skilled at arms. Well, he could beat anyone up, he was sure about that, and he was an amazing archer. Didn't they know how good he was? And he drew himself up to his almost 6 foot tall, and he made his way out without another word to his uncle, down towards the town, towards the town of Nottingham. Now, on the way to Nottingham, with his big Bolshoi proudness, he stopped and he cut himself a bow and arrows, and he spent the first day simply hewing an old piece of yew into a mighty bow and shafting himself grey goose feather fletched arrows. And with his new arrows and new bow, he felt confident he could outshoot whoever God put in his path. And so, because that was the kind of person Robin was, he swallowed, steeled himself, set his jaw, and said, I'm going to go and have an adventure today. And so he set off through the woods in search of it. Well, he saw, a little after midday, up to their cups, with full tankards of brown October, some lying, layabout, lethargic men who were all wearing the regalia of the foresters. These were people who should have been out making sure that nobody was pinching the king's deer. These were people who should have been keeping the roads safe and secure. And yet they were sat around drinking in the middle of the day, and Robin thought, well, this is no good deed a forester should be doing. When I'm a forester, I shall have something to say about it. And he looked at them, and there were 10 of them, and they were all in their 40s, and he went, I think discretion's probably the better part of valour here. And so even though he thought, I should tell these people, you're lucky, I'll leave it for today, and he started to walk off. But he heard a voice that he recognised because he'd heard it once before. It was a voice that told him to clear out. It was a voice that said, shove off. It was the voice of the man who had grabbed his mother and thrown her out into the snow and had backhanded him when he was a child. And the voice said, Oi, lads, look at this guy. Where are you going with your twopenny bow and your farthing arrows? And there was much mirth and merriment and laughter among the foresters. Good one, Dave. Nice. And Robin turned. And he looked at the drunken, feckless men laying about, and he said, oh, I'm just going to go and steal your jobs. I thought I'd go down to Nottingham town and prove that I could shoot, easily better than any of you, unless you'd like to try and prove me wrong. Well, there was a bit of a murmuring and a bit of hubbub, and then the man who had thrown his mother out into the cold said, all right, young stripling, and he pulled himself up and he said, get me a mark, someone get me a mark and put it on a tree over there. Set it 3 score paces away, and we'll see if you can hit it. And if you can, here's a pouch of coins for you. And if you can't, then we'll tan your hide, break your bow, break your arrows, break your arms, and send you on your way. And Robin said, let's up the stakes. That's 3 score yards away. Twice that. You see that herd of deer over there? And the archers looked, the foresters looked, and they said, no one could hit them. My head against your pouch of coins, if I don't shoot the finest among them from here. Just you watch. And he turned, knocked his grey goose-feathered arrow, drew his bow up, turned to where the deer stood and waited. And there was silence in the clearing while everyone watched the young boy who closed one eye, took a deep breath, and loosed his shaft. And as he did, there was a flutter of birds up in the trees. The deer looked spooked. The greatest among them leapt and was dead by the time it hit the ground. The arrow pierced into its skin and it was on the floor and gone. And there was a great, weighty moment while all eyes looked from Robin to the forester who'd issued the bet. And the forester who'd issued the bet was pissed. He was angry and he was drunk. And he turned and he picked up the coins and he said, "Fine then, I wish you good use of them." And he threw the coins down at Robin's feet. And Robin picked the coins up and he said, "Thank you very much," tied them around his belt and started to walk off. And it was a good thing that the forester was so drunk, because as he went off, he said, "All right, and here's an arrow to speed you on your way then." And he drew an arrow and he fired, and because he was 3 sheets to the wind, it went nowhere near Robin, but whistled past him. And he heard the deadly flight like a bird that whished past his hair. And he turned, and with all the impetuousness of youth, with arms that moved on their own, he said, "Ah, and that's your aim, I have nothing to worry about." Drew his own arrow, knocked it and loosed, and his flew straight and true and into the heart of the forester, who lay dead on the floor. And Robin shook for a moment. And he dropped his bow and he dropped his arrows, and his hearing just went. He could see in front of him the foresters who were up as if they were moving in slow motion. And they were shouting at him, but their mouths were moving and their arms were moving, but he couldn't hear the words. There was just this buzzing whiteness in his head. And they pointed, and one of them was down trying to help his friend who was definitely dead, and 2 of them came towards him. And Robin, having dropped his things, looked up the road towards Nottingham town and saw for himself there only jail, penury and death, same as his father. And he looked back the way he had come and saw only despair and disillusionment in the imagined eyes of his uncle Tom Gamester. "What have you done, Robin?" And so he turned and ran, and his feet carried him swifter than any of the men could follow him, because he had grown up gambling and tripping through Sherwood Forest, and he ran. And he ran, and he ran, and he ran, and he wept, and he ran, and he could hear in his head his mother's dying words, "Robin, Robin." And so Robin Hood became an outlaw and was forced to live in the greenwood, stealing his living from those passers-by. But where you or I or anyone we can see out on the street, when forced into such a situation, might lose their sense of moral compass, might lose their centre, might begin to rationalise and excuse things, might go, "Well, maybe my need is better than anybody's who comes through here." Robin heard his mother's dying voice and heard his father telling him stories of old Will of the Green. And he heard his father's character pressed into him. And he decided that he would become this figure, this legendary figure, this fabled, mythic father figure who stole only from those who could afford it and gave only to those who needed it. And so that was Robin's code. Driven into the woods as he was by unjust laws and evil men, he vowed and stayed true to it, never to harm any women who came through, any squires who worked for knights, any yeomen who worked for other lords. Nobody who worked for another was at risk, except for the priests who worked for God, but seemingly mostly for themselves. And so it was that the clergy and the lords, those abbots and dukes, were not safe from him or his band of merry men that he began to gather. Robin Hood became an outlaw, and eventually he would have his revenge on the lean sheriff and the fat bishop. But I believe we're probably running out of time for today, so I'm going to say that those are other stories for another time. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you.